In part 2 of this 3-part tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a cement wall background complete with procedural grunge texture and even cracks. And then we'll composite the Cobra Kai logo that we created in part 1 on top of that background and create realistic shadows to really solidify that this metal object is actually in our scene. Let's start by making that cement wall. For the cement, I have another texture, and in fact, a bunch of textures here that you can choose from. I'm gonna just pick the first one in the list and bring that out just below the base metal. And this is gonna be really, really bright, but I'm just gonna zoom out and scale this down. And obviously we need to make this darker. So let's start with just adding a curves effect. And the way that I like to do this, since it is so bright, is in 2 steps. First, just bring down the highs so that it just matches the overall brightness values of that original title animation. Let me find the brightest point of that, which would be right about here. I'm looking at this part of the wall right behind the logo, and I'm kind of just trying to match the same brightness levels as that. And I think that's pretty close. But now that I have that initial curves, instead of trying to add contrast with such little space down here in my actual curve editor, I'm going to just duplicate it, collapse this one up and reset the second one. And now I can add another pass at contrast. So maybe I'll bring down the darks a little bit, punch up the brights. I don't want to make it too much darker, so I'm gonna have to be careful with where I'm adding this contrast in. But that way we just see a little bit more texture in that cement wall, and it grunges it up a little bit. Now, I'd also like to tint this to be a little bit blue because I think the background here does have a little blue to it. So I'm gonna switch to my red channel and I'm gonna just pull out a little bit of red, not a lot. This is a very touchy thing to do, so I'm just gonna pull out a little bit of red, switch to green and do the same thing there, and that adds in a good amount of blue. That's probably too much, honestly, so I'm gonna add a tint effect right after that and turn the amount to tint down to maybe around 20, 25, and that just desaturates it a little bit so that blue isn't quite so intense. That looks pretty good. So this is without the effects and with, it just makes it much moodier. Now I would like to add some more grunge to this background because I think the original is dirtier, it has more erosion to it, so we can kind of recreate that with a few effects. I'm gonna start by pre-composing the cement texture, so Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C on a Mac, and I'll call this cement texture. Make sure that Move All Attributes is checked and click OK, and that way again it's cropped to the size of my comp, and I can give this a different label color, why don't we say cyan, and jump into it. Now we're gonna add a new solid, so Control or Command Y, it doesn't really matter what color it is. We're gonna use fractal noise again to add some texture, but we're gonna combine this with another effect, Find Edges. And if I apply this, just these two on its own creates a very unique texture, but from here, I could increase the contrast, maybe increase the brightness, and make this kind of grungy erosion texture that if I simply just multiply this on top of the background, really adds a lot of textural quality to that cement and makes it a little bit more unique. So I can play around with this to make it bigger or smaller. Maybe I want to increase the scale and increase the contrast. I could add a curves effect after this. If I wanted to boost the contrast a little bit more and make it more apparent, I don't want to overdo this, but maybe just a little bit of contrast there. And then we'll jump back into our main comp to see that now we've just got another layer of texture here. And like I said, I can go back in here and adjust the settings as much as I want to get something that maybe looks a little bit more unique or uniform, whatever you want to do to create something that just feels a little bit more grungy. Now, I think that's a little bit extreme, so I'm going to back off the contrast and lower the brightness a little bit. But the other thing that the original title has on its background that ours doesn't is cracks. And if I crank up the exposure compensation, you can really see just how many cracks there are in the wall back there. I think that we can recreate this pretty faithfully using advanced lighting. So I'm gonna jump back into the cement texture comp and I'll rename this layer Grunge and then make another layer. Again, doesn't matter what color it is, and I'll name this one Cracks 1, and we'll add the effect Advanced Lightning. Now, if you've never used this effect, it is pretty advanced. There are lots of properties, even an expert settings section. If you want to know what every single property does, again, the Effects of After Effects series, I have a video, click the card above to watch that video and learn everything about this effect that you could ever want to know. But we're just going to modify some of these settings to generate a cracking texture. I'm going to go to the glow settings first and turn the glow opacity all the way down because I don't need that glow. And I'm going to go into the core settings and turn the core opacity all the way up so that none of this is semi-transparent. Now, the way that this effect works is by using an origin and a direction point control in its default state to allow me to align this lightning strike wherever I want it. Obviously, I don't want it to look like lightning because this looks almost more like roots, like of something growing through the cement. That's not what I want. Instead, I want it to be a little bit more simplified. So I'm gonna go into the expert settings, and the first option is complexity. I can turn this down, and very quickly it gets much simpler. So maybe even just down to a complexity of 5, going from 6 to 5 makes a big difference. And then I can play around with some of these other settings, like turbulence. If I really crank this up, it's going to add in a lot more jagged edges in this core, which is more the vibe that I want for these cracks. I can also turn the forking down so there aren't quite as many strands coming off of the main core. I don't want to completely remove them, but if I dial it back a little bit and even hold down the control key while I do that to be more precise, I can get something that looks a little bit more controlled. Same thing with the decay. I can turn this down and that will extend those forks, but I don't want it to be so much that we're getting like this spider web look or something that's just a little too complex. So I'll dial that in to give me shorter forking, but allows me to have these branches that come off the main core. I think I'm gonna just continue cranking up the turbulence until I get something that really pushes off there. I might need to turn the decay up a little bit, but then I can use these 2 points to kind of direct where these cracks will live. So let's put one about here. I like the shape of that, but honestly, I think all these little tendrils, it's still a little too much. So I'm gonna turn my complexity down to 4 or maybe even 3, and then maybe I could turn the decay down a little bit and turn the forking down a little bit as well. And now we're starting to get something that is much more simplified from that advanced lightning look and giving me something that looks more like actual cracks in this cement. But obviously, it's a white line. It doesn't really look like a crack. So how can we do that? Let's change the core brightness from white to something that's more like a mid-tone gray. Click OK and change the blend mode to overlay. And this is going to blend into the background a lot better. Now this is gonna be kind of hard to see with this overlay blend mode, but if I make the core color even darker, we're gonna start to see that defined a little bit better while still having some of that texture come through of the cement background. But we can accentuate this even further if we add a bevel alpha effect. Let me type that out. Bevel alpha, and place that right after the advanced lightning. What this will do is give me this highlighted edge that I can control the direction of and even the depth of. What I want to set this to is 180 degrees so that the bottom edge contour of this crack is what's catching the light. So it looks like this is a crack into the surface of the cement. And if I turn up that edge thickness, I can make it look like it's deeper or shallower. So I think the default of 2 is actually just fine. I might just increase the intensity all the way up to 1. And zoomed out to 100%, you can see that that is a much more subtle crack effect now. It could be a little bit too subtle. If I go into the core radius, I might bump that up a little bit, but I don't want to go so far that it really starts to look artificial. I want to push it to maybe 2.5, and now it's there, but it's not overtaking anything. So let's jump back out into our main comp and make sure we turn off the original title, and you can see the crack now coming through. So I think that's working, and now we can just duplicate this and make a couple of copies. So let me grab these points and we'll add in some varying angles and different looking cracks throughout the background. So that one's pretty good. I'll duplicate it again, maybe move one over here, shift it around. You can play around with these settings as much as you want to get different looking cracks. Maybe you like all the extra forking, you want to simplify it a little bit. It's totally up to you how much detail you want to put into this background. But before we get too caught up in that, we really need to work on the lighting of this scene because the background is still extremely flat and the logo is just floating in front of it. We need to introduce this really strong vignette over the entire scene that isolates just that center part of the frame. So let's do that with an adjustment layer. I'll press Control-Alt-Y or Command-Option-Y on a Mac. And this again is using void, so it's a shape layer instead of a solid, but I'll call this vignette. And I'm going to apply the exposure effect to it. And I think this handles colors a little bit better than if we were to just add, say, a black solid and then feathered out a mask. This is going to handle the brights and the darks a little bit better. Even though I'm only working in 8 bits per channel, I'm not even taking advantage of a higher bit depth than 8 bits per channel. It's still gonna give us a better result. So I'm just gonna back off the gamma and the exposure exposure to make everything super dim. And then I'm gonna zoom out and switch to my pen tool and draw a mask. Now, because this is a shape layer, I need to make sure to switch over to Tool Creates Mask before I draw my path. But now that that's set, I can draw a mask just like any other regular solid layer. And I'm gonna make kind of like an egg shape here. The reason I'm going off the top is because that light source from the original is kind of on the top edge of the frame. Let me rearrange my layers. You can see that the light kind of spills off in this direction. So that's kind of what I'm gonna try and simulate with this feathered mask. So let's go into our mask options by pressing M on the keyboard and actually double tapping M to see all of them. I first need to change it from add to subtract so that we're left with the bright part in the middle of the frame. And then I need to increase the feather just by clicking and dragging this value. Now this can be really big, probably something around 500 pixels. And now we've got that really strong vignette that's just highlighting the center of the frame where the logo is, and it's looking really nice. Now, obviously I can play around with this as much as I want to kind of sculpt this light and fit the logo without making it too dark and kind of blending into the background. I can also modify the exposure levels, but I'm just gonna crank up my exposure compensation to see that I'm not making anything pure black. If I was going too far, then we're gonna start getting this really dark banding, which at the normal exposure wouldn't be that visible, but I just don't wanna push things too far to black. I wanna keep it dark, but not too muddy. So somewhere in there looks pretty good and we can move on. Now, the issue that I'm seeing here is that it looks like the logo is just floating. It doesn't at all look like it's up against that wall, so we need to create some contact shadows. And for this, we're gonna be using the logo source layer. So I'm gonna make a duplicate of that layer and bring it just below the base metal layer. So this, again, is just the standard flat black logo. And what I wanna do is actually add a fill effect, because remember, this effect is going to be completely procedural. So if we were to ever put something into this logo source comp that wasn't already black, this is gonna throw off our shadows. So I wanna make sure that all my shadows are black by just including a black fill before anything else. But to create the actual long radial shadows that we see in this original title, where all of these shadows are nicely falling off the edges and coming off in different harsh directions, is use a radial blur. So I'll shut off the original title and we'll start by adding a CC radial blur. There's 3 different types of radial blur in After Effects. CC radial blur is the one we want. And I'm gonna change the type to straight zoom. What this allows us to do is blur off of a centered point. So this center point control is what's going to allow us to blur from a specific direction. We wanna just move this up a little bit outside of the comp to match that same kind of light source that we've artificially created in our scene, where there's a bright spot up here. Remember, on CC Blobby Lies, we push the light towards the wall. That's how we want the shadows to fall off. You can see on mine already, we're starting to create that shadow that's similar to what we have in the original title right here. It's falling off of the logo radially. So that first instance, I don't want the shadow to be nearly that blurred out. Let me start by just renaming this Shadow 1, and we'll give it a different color. Let's say orange for the shadows. I'll zoom in really close so we can see the details easily. And what I wanna do is just back off that amount to be very tight. This first initial shadow, I just wanna be really tight up against the logo. Then I'm going to duplicate my layer and increase the blur a little bit. Not a lot, maybe just going from 2 to say 4 or 5. And what I'd also like to do is add a Gaussian blur just before that radial blur. And what this is going to do, if I solo the layer and I turn off radial blur, I'm just going to ever so softly blur that out. So that combined with the radial blur, we're just taking these harsh edges and softening them out a little bit. And 7 is probably a little too much. Honestly, I just wanna take a little bit of the harshness off, maybe 2 pixels, and that's plenty. So there's our second shadow layer. I'm gonna duplicate it and repeat that process. Increase the amount to be a little bit further down, maybe increase the blurriness just a little bit so it's softer as it falls away from the logo, then duplicate it again, do the same thing. Increase the amount until it's much further and we can kind of zoom out so we can see how long these shadows are really getting, and then increase the Gaussian blur just a little bit more. So with those 4 layers of shading, you can really see just how much of a difference having those contact shadows really makes to this overall scene. It really makes it look like that piece of metal is up against that wall and it feels much more like it's actually there. Comparing it to the original, I honestly feel like I could push it even further. So why don't we duplicate this one more time, increase that amount so that it goes a little bit further down, and make it just slightly softer. And I think now my shadows are nice and locked in, very dark where it's making contact with the wall and then falling off very naturally the further away from the logo that it gets. I think that I could just probably make the background a little bit darker. So I'll grab the vignette and I'll just decrease the gamma there a little bit, maybe pull the mask in, but this is all obviously up to you. You can make this look however you want. I'm just trying to match the original as closely as possible. But with that background texture, the lighting and the shading, we've really solidified this to being part of the scene now. And I think I want to add in the scaling animation that looks like the camera is moving in on the original. So to do that, I'm going to parent everything to a null object. So Control-Alt-Shift-Y or Command-Option-Shift-Y to generate a null, and I'll call this scale up and move it just below the vignette. I want to parent everything that makes up the logo and the background to it. So not the vignette adjustment layer, but all these things, including the logo source at the bottom that we can't even see, because that is being used as the track matte here, so it needs to scale up as well. And I'll just parent all of these things to the scale up null. Now I can bring up the scale and change the scale of the entire scene using that single property. And what I want to do is match the scale animation to the original title. So I'll go to about where we can see the logo, maybe crank up the exposure compensation until I can see that defined edge of the top of the logo there. And then I'll press Control-R to bring up my rulers and click and drag on the top one and drag out a guide to that top edge. That way I can reference the scale compared to my own. So I'll turn off the exposure compensation, click on the scale and tap the down arrow key until it matches. So there we go. The background does need to be scaled up a little bit. So let's grab that cement texture, scale it up so it fills the comp, and then set a scale keyframe at that point in time. Then I'll go back into the original title, go forward in time until it starts to fade out again. Again, crank that exposure compensation and find where that top edge is. At this point in time, I'll move my guide up and then we'll match the scale again. So shut off that exposure compensation, increase the scale until it touches that top edge right about there. And now I've got my animation of this slowly panning in over time. But I obviously don't want it to stop here and I don't want it to be static before the first keyframe. So I'm gonna use that same speed graph trick that we used in the reflections to match that speed. So I'll go to the beginning with my speed graph enabled, click and drag while holding Control and match that up so it's a nice straight line. Do the same thing on this end, increase the scale, hold down Control to be precise, and now I've got a consistent speed scale animation, and I can delete the two middle keyframes, and this will just scale up slowly over time. So I'm gonna shut off the visibility of that scale up null. I can get rid of this guide by just dragging it off the top of my comp, and now we've got that nice slow push in on the logo over the entire comp. Next, let's create that fade in and out. And I want to do this with some effects to make it a little bit more cinematic. So I'm going to make an adjustment layer, Control-Alt-Y or Command-Option-Y, and we'll call this fade in out. And I'll move that just below the vignette. I'm gonna add a levels effect to this adjustment layer, and the reason I'm using levels is because I can treat the brightness values of this a little bit more like actual film if I crush the darker areas of the image like this, leaving just the brightest pixels visible during that fade in. And to get rid of all these brighter pixels, I'm gonna grab the output white and drag it all the way to the left. If I had only done this slider, it's effectively just taking a black solid and fading it from 0 to 100% opacity. But when you combine it with this extra input black slider, it's going to make something that looks a little bit more cinematic. So let's go to the first frame of the composition and set a keyframe on the histogram, and then go forward until it's completely faded in, which I believe is around the 2.5 second mark. Somewhere right about there. And then I'll just set another keyframe by going to the levels effect and just clicking reset at that point in time. If I press U, it'll bring up the keyframes and you'll see that it just added another keyframe resetting all those values, but my initial state is still there. So I'm now fading up, seeing those brighter pixels first, and then having all of the darker parts of the image fade in with them. So I just want to ease into that keyframe, F9 on the keyboard to do easy ease, and maybe just back it off a little bit. But this way it fades in gradually and comes to that resting point. And then I'll go forward in time to where we start to fade out, which I believe is around the 3 second mark, right about there. And I'm gonna set another keyframe just by clicking the add keyframe button, and then go forward in time to wherever we start to not see anything again. So probably right about there is where the logo's all the way to black. And then I'll just copy and paste this keyframe over so that it fades back out to black. Another thing we can do is desaturate the image a little bit during that fade in. So I'm gonna grab a tint effect, put it right after the levels effect, and turn the amount to tint down to maybe around 50, somewhere in there, and set a keyframe. But I want that to be obviously at the start of my adjustment layer. But that way we're just tinting those values so it's not so saturated as it fades up, and I'll change that down to 0 and easy ease into that keyframe. So we're now not only fading up from black, but we're also fading in the saturation a little bit. And I'll just mirror that here, set another keyframe, go to this point, and change that back up to the initial value. So now we've got a nice cinematic fade in and out. Let's take a look at that as a whole. Very nice, fades in, we've got all that gritty texture in the background, reflections moving around the grungy, rusty metal logo. Everything's working really, really well. So all that's left is some finishing touches for the atmosphere of the scene. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in part 3.